the way in which the mainstream right tries to frame Antifa activism is that Antifa is going to beat up your uncle for being racist
Yeah.
and watching Fox News. And that's simply not what anti-fascists do.
Welcome back to part 2 of our series on fascism. If you haven't got a chance to check out the first one, hit pause. Pause, not stop, because come back. But go back and listen to our first one. We have a fascinating conversation with Stas, who we're going to talk to again today. And in our first episode, we define and really understand what fascism is, and how anti-fascism is a direct response to fascism. These two movements, fascism and anti-fascism, are not two sides of the same coin, but instead, anti-fascism is a direct consequence of the fascist movement. It is people defending themselves against fascist actions. And so in this episode, we'll dig even deeper into what anti-fascism is and what its tactics look like. And at the end, we have a treat for everybody where we talk through how the UK punk scene became fertile ground for fascist recruitment in the 1970s. Daniel, what'd you think of this episode?
Yeah, I thought this was a really important conversation because although most of us would identify as anti-fascists, we don't realize the challenges and often the real dangers that anti-fascists organizers face. Even Stas faced doxing and harassment as a result of his work.
He was worried for his life for 6 months after he got doxed. He took different routes home. He had to harden his house, as he puts it. It was a terrifying experience.
So given this violence and harassment, this both sides framing that the media has talked about Antifa with has been really frustrating to hear. This was a really refreshing conversation for me because we got to hear from someone with firsthand experience with anti-fascist movements. So it was great to hear from someone who actually knows what they're talking about and knows how these movements actually function.
Yes. And that's exactly how I grew up learning about it. And that's how, hate to say it, but my grandma talks about it, is they're the same thing and they feed off of each other and it's like two gangs fighting each other. And as we learned in the first episode, that is just simply not the case. So, thanks for sticking around for part 2. Check out part 1 if you haven't. And with that, here is a very honest conversation with someone making positive change just outside of Vancouver.
When we hear about Antifa, most people think about these masked, violent people, and certainly there's been a lot of effort to portray them that way. But does Antifa or anti-fascism center violence in the same way that fascist movements do?
No, it does not. Anti-fascists do not center violence. And in fact, what we know as researchers and recently I've had a chance to look at an advanced copy of an actual empirical study that counted anti-fascist events in a European country. It hasn't been published yet, so I'm sort of jumping the gun a little bit to say this, but what it does is it actually gives us the numbers to validate what people like Mark Bray and myself have been saying, which is that 90% of what anti-fascist activists do does not rise to the level of categorizing as violence.
I was going to say, you use that 90%.
Yeah.
Most of it, 90% is nonviolent.
90% of it is nonviolent. The vast 9 out of 10 times what anti-fascists do is absolutely, positively cannot be characterized by any single person as violence without having to like jump through some crazy hoops and do contortions while you're at it. Like it is just not, you really would have to stretch it. Because what mostly anti-fascists are doing is frankly boring run-of-the-mill social movement work. A lot of what they do, and in particular boring run-of-the-mill counter movement work. So I talk about this in terms of in my book. I describe this as saying that a lot of what anti-fascists do and the kind of Antifa, the stuff we associate with Antifa, what Antifa is doing, what the groups who operate under formal names of, pick your city Antifa or pick your region Antifa, what they are doing is primarily research. They are researchers. And they're doing research, and I talk about this as intelligence gathering or information gathering. They're trying to get information. So they're trying to figure out, what does the fascist movement look like? Because it's a constantly changing movement. It's constantly responding to both the counter movement moves that they're getting from anti-fascists and the public discourse that's happening in the world, and that they need to constantly be morphing and changing and shifting to address those things.
Change strategies.
So,
yeah,
exactly. You're changing your strategies. You're changing your branding. You're changing, even your ideology to adapt to the context that you're operating in, because that ideology that worked in the 19 teens and the 20s and 30s would not work today. Like, people are just not going to, people are not going to join that kind of movement that like Mussolini or Hitler tried to build. We're talking about 100 years ago now. People are it's not the context. So it's constantly changing movement. So anti-fascists have to understand that. They have to understand, what is that ideology? They have to understand how is that ideology being framed, being put out into the public. They have to understand what about that ideology is resonating with people. And so there's a lot of that. And then a lot of that intelligence is also just because there's that stigma, because a lot of people who are fascists hide behind, pseudo-anonymous online identities, or they hide behind, basically kind of doing movement work without being explicitly out there in the public sphere, or hoping that they're not caught, basically, when they are out in the public sphere, hoping that they aren't identified. So they're trying to identify, who are the fascists.
Mm-hmm.
And then that brings me to kind of the next thing that they do that is part of the boring, mundane elements of anti-fascist work, which is education. A lot of what anti-fascists do is educational. It's about everything from educating the public, and that public can vary from very specific kinds of supporters of anti-fascism to a wider general kind of campaign of education. Podcasts, exactly. That are presenting the information that has been developed in the intelligence and information gathering. So you're teaching about, who are the fascists? What is the fascist movement? What are the symbols and the codes and the language that they use? Because there's a lot of internal codes, like any other subculture, like any other social movement. There's a lot of terminology that they use that doesn't make any sense to anybody outside of it. So you got to educate people when they use a certain kind of term that seems weird or seems mundane, or even something as simple as like what happened with the OK sign, where it started out online as a kind of way to try to prank the left and prank anti-fascists. They were going to start doing the OK sign, and they were going to say that it was a fascist symbol.
And what's the OK sign?
The OK sign.
Oh, like with your fingers.
The circle with the fingers, yeah, with
Okay.
the fingers and the so you do that, and the idea behind that was like, we're gonna prank them, and all of these journalists and all these people on the left are gonna be like, this is a hate sign, and it's just an OK sign, and we're just doing it because like we want to mess with people. So they start by doing that, except then people start doing it all the time who are fascists, and they sort of do it ironically, unironically. And when they do it ironically, unironically, it becomes a fascist symbol in that way. And so the job of anti-fascists was to parse that out and to say, look, here's kind of what they were trying to do, but it backfired. And it became kind of like their symbol of who we are to each other. and to point that out. So that's education, right?
That's so
Doing
interesting.
that kind of thing, putting that out in the world. So you'll notice a lot of formal anti-fascist groups they'll have blogs, they'll have sites where they catalog information, they'll have a very strong presence on social media as a way of disseminating information, education campaign. But also disseminating that information is that doxing element, that public shaming. So, which again is not violent from the anti-fascist perspective. It's
Because there's a
about
social stigma for it. Everybody's like,
right,
hey, this is bad.
exactly, and you're simply leveraging. The idea is you're leveraging public pressure. And I'm not going to
Knowledge.
sit here and say that people don't use that doxing to threaten people who are on the far right. That happens.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a pretty clear history here that people on the far right are not being violently victimized outside of very specific kinds of protest contexts or outside of very specific kinds of social contexts. The way in which the far right goes and harasses people who are subjects of doxing.
So that 10% of time that anti-fascists do use violence, they're not going to people's houses to threaten violence.
Yes.
No, they're not. And when they've come to people's houses, it's primarily been to identify them as fascist to their neighbors. And it's not necessarily a tactic that people do these days because of the way in which online dissemination works. But what I sort of talk about is the old days. And by the old days, I'm talking about like the 1980s and 90s and sort of the early to mid aughts. In the old days, what anti-fascists would frequently have to do is they would have a demonstration outside of a person's home sometimes. And it would be the crux of the demonstration was, hey, neighbors of this person, you should be aware that this person is a fascist with a proclivity towards violence. It was never, we're here, we know you're here, and come on out and we're going to beat you up. Like that's never the intention.
It was the analog posting on Facebook, shouting in the town square.
Exactly. It was the analog version of that. And which is why it's largely fallen out of favor. There's not as many house demos as there used to be. There's not as many workplace demonstrations as there used to be, because you don't have to do it anymore. You can do all of this stuff digitally. So that just, there's very rarely, I'm not going to say it never happens, because again, historically it has happened.
Individuals.
It's a decentralized movement. There are certain very clear contexts. Just to give an example of one, there was an individual who had taken responsibility for an attempted assassination against an anti-fascist, who was seen in a bar, who was assaulted. I mean, yes, that's an assault, but this is also a person who has been identified as an attempted murderer, who law enforcement did not act upon at all. Even though this person had been identified, that information had been shared with law enforcement. So even there, we're talking about violence in a very specific kind of context, So
much so.
The way in which the right, the mainstream right, tries to frame Antifa activism is that Antifa is going to beat up your uncle for being racist.
Yeah.
And watching Fox News. And that's simply not what anti-fascists do. Anti-fascists are not engaging in violence simply because a person has personal prejudices. They're engaging in violence in very, very specific contexts. And even in those contexts, they're engaging in violence with a kind of sense of restraint. And there's a great scholarly article by Nigel Copsey and Samuel Merrill that talks about restraint specifically, that anti-fascists understand the bounds of what they can do in terms of use of force and what the contexts of that use of force are, and even the bounds of how to talk about that use of force. So they understand, because they are bound by certain kinds of ethical and strategic constraints in a way the fascists are not, because fascists center violence, because fascists place violence at the center of their movement and at the center of their ideology. Whereas for anti-fascists, it is, again, it's a tool in their toolkit that is used because counter movements, one of the strategic goals of counter movements is to damage the other movement in order to demobilize it, in order to keep it from being able to do what it's going to do. So for anti-fascists, when they use violence, they're thinking very strategically. How are we going to make sure that this movement cannot mobilize? So when you see the kinds of clashes publicly between fascists and anti-fascists, what's happening there is that anti-fascists are coming to this with this idea that the fascist movement is mobilizing. They're having a protest. How do we stop that protest? And they will have tried other means prior to that.
Tell their neighbors, post on their Facebook page, hey, look.
Yeah, but also tell the town, try and pull, if there's a permit, try and pull the permit. If there's if there's police protection, try to pull, try and get them to pull that. Try and do anything you can to make it harder for them to rally. If it's in a specific venue, make sure they lose that venue. All of that is done nonviolently. It's through phone calls and emails and public pressure and even legal challenges sometimes, which are all the things that happened in Charlottesville prior to Unite the Right. There was all of that kind of campaigning. And when all of that failed, the only tactic left was counter-protest. And given the size and the scope and the way in which the fascists mobilized in Charlottesville for Unite the Right, the only effective counter-protest was the use of force.
And that's where you get the pictures.
Yeah, because the fascists had come to use force. They'd come to beat people up. The famous quote from Cornel West that they're going to crush them like roaches because they were standing there and holding the space non-violently, and the fascists had come to destroy them. The people of color and clergy and people who were mobilizing, in support of these activists were standing there non-violently, and the fascists had come to potentially literally kill them. And they certainly did on that day in terms of the murder of Heather Heyer and the injury of the 19 other protesters. So they came with violence. And if that movement sees nonviolent opposition as an easy target, as a soft target, one has to find a way to be able to oppose that movement that makes it a hard target, that makes it harder for them, that makes it challenging. And that to some extent has been effective. We don't see the kinds of rallies. Certainly there's a recent article by Robert Evans and an episode of the It Could Happen Here podcast where they cover Portland, where Portland had been the epicenter for this. Portland is the right-wing boogeyman. And this summer was the first summer where there hadn't been a major far-right rally and major clashes in Portland. And what Evans identifies and what the podcast discusses, what the people on the podcast discuss, is why that was the case. And it was the case because of anti-fascists mobilizing. And it was the case because anti-fascists mobilized with a genuine diversity of tactics. And what that meant was that there were different ways that people could engage in anti-fascism because the anti-fascists made it clear that Antifa or anti-fascism didn't mean necessarily like going to the protest and busting heads.
Yeah.
They weren't against it. And this is part of what worked in that strategy, is that the people who made that clear were like, some people are cut out for that. Some people, that's what they want to do. They're going to do it. We're not going to denounce them. We're not going to try to distance ourselves from them. We're all part of one movement. And so there was a space there for people to come and be militant and to do that kind of direct confrontation and to use that force against the force of fascists. And if you haven't followed what the fascists were doing in Portland, if all you ever heard was about what the anti-fascists were doing in Portland, you didn't hear about the fascists coming armed and assaulting counter protesters before any anti-fascist hits anybody else. You didn't hear about the sniper nest they put up in a parking garage facing towards the anti-fascist rally that was countering them, that the Portland police found. And rather than, even just detaining those people, simply told them to, shut it down, guys.
Go to a different rooftop.
Yeah, just put it away, guys. You can join your friends down there. Like, and this is all documented. Like, we have this. This is what the fascists were like in Portland. The fascists were violent. The fascists were armed. The fascists were coming looking for violence against against vulnerable populations. And we've known, those of us who study the hate crimes element of this, have seen that the actual bias crimes, the assaults against vulnerable, historically marginalized people, rise in the immediate days prior to and after an event in a city. Because these folks, if they're local, they get amped up. If they're coming from out of town, they're coming from out of town to hurt people. So, they either do it because they're already amped up prior, think of like what we saw, the way in which we saw the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where they had that march the night before. Imagine without that march, like where all those people sort of went as they're milling about town, looking for a fight, looking for violence, looking to cause harm. And then imagine what they would be like, had they not been so thoroughly routed in Charlottesville, what they do afterwards, because they're amped up and they're feeling violent.
They're with their buddies, they're with their friends, they feel like part of a group.
Exactly. So this is the context. This is the context of violence that happens. And that's where you see that use of force coming into play, that use of violence coming into play. And that's where, coming back to that Copsian Merrill piece, that restraint comes in. Because the anti-fascist side, again, has been, one would have to say, very restrained given who they're up against and given the kind of violence that the people they're up against have mobilized and have used. We're talking about fistfights and blunt objects and things of that nature against people who have shown, certainly in the past, and one can fairly easily predict in the future, that they're willing to use lethal force. But it's in this context. It's in this very specific kind of protest context. It's in this very specific context where a group of people have shown up ready for violence.
So the idea of Antifa as a primarily violent organization is a misconception. Are there any other misconceptions about maybe who these people are? Was there anything that surprised you as you interviewed these people? They were maybe different from what you expected?
Yeah. I mean, the image that one likes to project is a caricature of a left-wing activist that the right projects, and the narrative that you see, especially in the internal discussions of anti-fascists, is skinny vegan white boys.
Yeah.
And there are certainly skinny vegan anarchist white boys that are involved in anti-fascism, but in actually being able to interview anti-fascists and in being able to particularly do ethnography, you get a very different picture from the inside about who anti-fascist activists are. So like I said, there are certainly the skinny vegan white boys, but that whiteness is sometimes a structural whiteness or the conditional whiteness, because I found a fair amount of Jewish people who are involved in anti-fascism, which makes sense. Anti-Semitism at the core of fascist conspiracy theory and fascist ideology. It's totally logical that there would be Jewish people involved. I found gender parity So this idea that, and
Oh.
again, this varies within formal groups. So, I can't say this for every single, Antifa collective out there, or anti-fascist group that's out there, but certainly in the anti-fascist groups that I was able to engage in ethnographic work with, and my observations of other anti-fascist groups during that time, many of them had gender parity. So you had an equal number of people who identified as male or masculine, and an equal number of people who identified as women,
It's interesting.
and a significant, actually, I would say, overrepresentation of trans and gender nonconforming people.
It's interesting because when we think of Antifa as this violent organization, we also think of it as very hyper masculine. So it's very interesting that you actually do see gender parity.
Yeah, and that gender
That's
parity
cool.
that gender parity operates in the streets the same way, it operates. So again, when we think about like that Antifa activist who's out there fighting the fascists, they are just as likely to be a woman or a trans person or a gender nonconforming person or a non-binary person as they are to be a man. That they are out there because, as I point out in my book, fascists pose a threat to them. Fascists pose a direct inherent threat. So there's, in my research, I found actually a bit of an overrepresentation of people who were gay, lesbian, queer identified, and bisexual. So again, people who are directly being threatened by fascism, people who are vulnerable to fascism. I found there are significant numbers of people who are Muslim. There was significant representation of people of color, especially this very much aligns with the demographics of the locality. So if you're looking at a place that has significant populations of people of color, you're going to see greater activism by people of color in anti-fascism, and even in the kind of militant anti-fascist groups. And one of the things that an anti-fascist pointed out to me, particularly about that question of people of color, and that myth of the white boy street fighter, is that frequently when we think about the risk involved in engaging in public violence in that kind of context, we need to be aware of the way in which the state and the criminal justice system is going to respond to certain kinds of actors. That there is a greater risk for a person of color in that kind of context because there's a greater risk of identification and potential victimization by fascists, but also a greater risk of potential consequences, let's just say, from engagement with law enforcement, and
That makes a lot
engagement
of
with the
sense.
criminal justice system. In that kind of context.
Are all the members also younger millennials, or do you see it diversity in age as well?
There's definitely a diversity in age, and when I did my formal work, so I have to kind of distinguish between when I did the formal research period of interviews, ethnography, things of that nature, and the kind of observations I've been making over the years up to today. So what I've seen what I saw at the time, and when I interviewed people, my age range was from people who were, I think my youngest respondent was about 19 years old, to my oldest interview respondent who identified as a militant anti-fascist was in their 60s.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a range here. My average age actually landed somewhere in the late 20s. So uh, frankly, the typical anti-fascist activist, if we're looking at who they were, they tend to be somebody who's probably in their 20s to early 30s. And increasingly now we're seeing generationally that the people who I was interviewing, who I was doing ethnography with, they haven't dropped out. So a lot of them are also engaging in activism and are engaging in anti-fascism, and they're now in their 40s. So some of them are now hitting their 50s.
Some of them they call Grand Tifa.
Yeah, the Grand Tifa, and that's really for the people who are like even older than that. The people who are out in the streets who are the boomers, because there are boomers who are out there at anti-fascist protests. And again, they're probably not up front like trying to clash with with fascists, but doing anti-fascism means doing that variety of things. Counter protesting anti-fascism is done in a variety of different ways, and there are a variety of roles that people can play. So you can be a 75, 80-year-old boomer and out in the streets, with a sign, or even doing something as simple as like helping to provide food, because these are sometimes large events. Maybe,
I was
you
thinking
might
giving out
be
water. Yeah.
giving out water. Exactly. There are all kinds of ways that people can, there are all kinds of things that people can do in a protest setting. They don't require you to like actually have to hit a fascist, that provide. And I've seen, I've collected quite a bit of Antifa posters and artwork, particularly the stuff that's more geared towards the militant and violent side of things, to do a kind of content analysis of it. And it makes me think of one where, like, there's the image. It's sort of based on the old propaganda posters of, like, that person at the front is there because of all the people sort of behind them. Like when they're punching, there's one, it's like they're punching for you. So there's like the black bloc protester, and then there's like 3 or 4 other figures behind them who do all that support work that makes that confrontation possible, that makes that action possible. And those people, those are the people who, for whatever reason, can't do that or won't do that. Maybe they have a moral objection to doing that, but they don't necessarily have a moral objection to someone doing that on their behalf. Because shortly after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, there's a very interesting essay that was published that talked about the idea of outsourcing violence, and this idea that we frequently outsource violence in our society and the use of force. And we've developed this institution that we're supposed to outsource it to, which is the police.
Yeah.
And when we think about those protest contexts, frequently the police are not exactly engaging in their monopoly on the use of force is not being mobilized to protect the public from the fascists.
Neutral at best.
Neutral, exactly. Neutral in the best case scenario. Neutral in many cases is simply the way in which police are lined up in the context of these events provides support to fascists, and that might just that has to do with simply like protest policing deployment strategies. That's the neutral at best scenario. And then there's some of the stuff that has come out about the Portland Police Department and some of the collusion that it had with Patriot Prayer and various Proud Boys over the years. So it's something that also creates a situation for anti-fascists. And we have to kind of think about, like, if you're going to meet a violent movement that will eliminate you if you try to meet it with nonviolence. Fascists love a nonviolent opposition because it's easy. You can stand on your moral high ground all you want, and the fascists will still kill you for it.
It is a warrior picking on a gatherer.
Exactly. Exactly. So there is this at least understanding by people that has to be met with something. So we can outsource that. We can outsource that. And in theory, we could outsource that to the state. There has been state anti-fascism. There have been criminalizations and the actual intervention of law enforcement against fascism historically. Even in the US context, it hasn't been good. It hasn't been effective, clearly. But there have been these elements of state intervention. And what anti-fascists are doing is, rather than outsourcing that violence, they're insourcing it, because they're members of those social movements that they're defending here. They're not anti-fascists. Aren't just this is one of the myths about Antifa. If we come back to the myths, is that anti-fascists are simply these people who organized kind of out of nowhere to be anti-fascists. And I know we're going back quite a while because we've been talking for a while here today, but going back to what I said earlier about how anti-fascists become anti-fascists because they're doing other kinds of social movement work. And fascism represents a very unique and distinct threat to the movements and the populations that those movements are trying to work on behalf of. So if that's the case, anti-fascists are always embedded in other social movements. It makes them responsible to the people. They're embedded in networks of people and networks of movements, and there's a responsibility to those networks. So in many ways, and I talk about this in the book, that a lot of what anti-fascists do is democratizing some of that, because they are responsible to these movements, because the decisions that they make internally about how to respond are democratic, are directly democratic.
Oh, really? Can you unpack that a little bit more? What does democratic mean in that sense?
It means that strategic decisions are frequently done based on ideally striving for consensus. So when here we're talking about formal groups, and they're so when it comes to a formal group, to a group with a whatever name, Antifa, when they decide to engage in an action, that decision is made after a process of deliberation. It's made by the members of that group, and generally striving for consensus. When that can't happen, there is usually a vote, and often structured around some sort of supermajority. So it's not just the simple 50+1, because there's frequently risk involved in no matter what you're doing. If you're just public shaming someone, there's risk of a blowback. There's risk of something.
There's not just a small group at the top handing down decisions, all the members.
No, there's no group anywhere handing down decisions, despite what the right would like to tell you about George Soros, or I guess apparently maybe like Joe Biden in his most in his most dark Brandon phase.
Dark Brandon.
I mean, I recently heard like a right-wing person, one of those people who likes to brand themselves as a neither left nor right populist, but somehow ends up on Tucker Carlson, list off we're against the CIA, the FBI, the IRS, Antifa. Like Antifa is some sort of government law enforcement agency. I'm like, I don't know when anti-fascists got deputized. Right, so there's
they wouldn't want to be.
Yeah, that doesn't exist. Like it's just, I mean, that's a myth that's been created in these like weird right-wing circles, that there's some sort of on high like order. Even if a formal anti-fascist group in a community decides on one thing, like they decide to have a protest, they can't make everyone at that protest, that there isn't this kind of like internal discipline, because the people who are going to show up are going to be a diverse group of people with a diverse level of engagement. And that's where that diversity of tactics piece comes in, is that like ideally they show up with an understanding that like some people are going to wear goofy costumes and hold funny signs and try to drown out the people, and some people are going to be more confrontational with them. And both of those things are necessary, because both of those things make that fascist movement not able to do what it's supposed to do, whatever it is that it's trying to do. And it works. If you do it, if you mobilize enough, if you increase the cost of participation, and unfortunately, frequently through the use of violence, the fascists will stop. They will. One of the things I'm playing with conceptually, and I'm hoping to get some hard data for it as a real quick kind of research project, is I'm thinking about this again in terms of hard and soft targets.
Okay.
And we can see, especially the way in which the Proud Boys, who used to come to Portland for the fighting season in the summer, didn't come to Portland this year. Instead, because Portland's a hard target.
Oh, okay.
Come to Portland, you're gonna, they brag on social media how they're looking for a fight, but they're coming for a fight that they've frequently lost. that they frequently lost. And if they didn't lose the actual physical fight, they certainly lost the fight a lot of the time in the court of public opinion. And so now you see them mobilizing against soft targets. So they go to school board meetings and complain about CRT and gender inclusive education and things of that nature. And they're going to trans events particularly during Pride events, but also just trans and drag events and things of that nature. They're doing these things because they've identified these are the soft targets. We're starting to see, particularly where there's counter mobilizations, that those counter mobilizations are starting to have an impact. I think one of the ones that I saw recently was John Brown Gun Club showed up to counter protest a group of Proud Boys at a drag queen story hour. And there's photos of the looks on the faces of those Proud Boys and associated fascists when a group of armed counter protesters show up. And you can see how demoralized they are because they've lost that intimidation factor. They've lost that ability to stand there and scare people. And they're so demoralized by it. So it works. It works. It's a tactic that, for better or worse, is effective. And it's effective because it's part of a wider kind of social movement.
So you talk about how anti-fascist movement is a cultural movement as much as it is a political one. So I know a lot of the history of fascism and anti-fascism is centered around the punk subculture. I'm just curious why the punk subculture was attractive to these movements.
And what is the punk subculture? Because I was so curious. I think of it as just punk music. I had no idea there was a whole subculture along with it. Wait, what is that?
So let's start with punk. So you're right in saying that punk is a genre of music. So it's a music with a particular style. It encompasses these days a wide variety of musical styles and even a wide variety of ideological stances and positions, from some things that would be characterized as right-wing to a fairly large, I'm going to call it apolitical, because it doesn't take an explicit stance one way or the other in terms of ideology, to very explicitly like far left and certainly anarchist punk. So there's a genre of music, variety of ideological positions, variety of styles that all kind of get folded into, and certainly subgenres and sub-styles that are punk derivative, that are part of the same maybe scene, so that they're all part of a kind of similar space that people operate in subculturally. So there's that genre of music. And one of the things that scholars of subculture have noticed as a kind of pattern is that particular kinds of youth stylistic expressions, so the way in which people dress, do their hair, express themselves in terms of the way they present themselves to the world, are associated with certain genres of music. So there were, even in the 1960s, so there would be a band like The Who was associated with the mod subculture, whereas the Rolling Stones were more of a rocker band. And we tend to think of them as being kind of both in the same genre, but they were associated with different groups of people in terms of how they presented themselves and in terms of who they were. So this is an element of subculture broadly, that there's these subgroups of people who have a distinct way of presenting themselves to the world, who have frequently a distinct set of beliefs about who they are and why they do these things. And then that's associated with certain kinds of musical expression. And punk is one of those, in part because punk, the genre, was partially a means of selling clothes by one boutique or a series of boutiques in London in the late 1970s,
Oh,
which
really?
then drew a lot of media attention, and people reproduced that style in other places. And what made punk in many ways unique as both a musical genre and a subculture, and there's a kind of syncretism, these things that kind of come together there, or maybe more like an elective affinity is the sociological term, where like two things work really well together. So what punk did was it placed passion and spirit and expression ahead of musical capability, let's just say. It made amateurish and even poor performance a value rather than a hindrance in terms of musical genre. And what that did was that encouraged people. So unlike a lot of rock music that came prior to punk, a lot of that encouraged musicianship that would reach a kind of elite level. So anybody who was at the amateur level of musicianship was striving to achieve some sort of success or elite, big stadiums, big halls, big whatever.
You needed your 10,000 hours.
You
as Malcolm
really did
Gladwell
need your
would say.
you needed your 10,000 hours. And even with those 10,000 hours, your hope was that you get big.
Mm-hmm.
What punk did was punk changed that. And there's a famous punk scene, it's called Sniffing Glue, where they had this kind of image where it says, here's a chord, here's another chord, now go start another, here's a third one, go start a band. All you got to do is learn to like play these three chords, get together with your friends, it doesn't matter how good or bad you are, start a band. And we don't want, the bands don't need to play in professional venues, they can play anywhere. So it doesn't even have to be like, it's a bar, which is typically the sort of circuit for amateur bands. Amateur rock bands don't have to play a bar, play a community hall, play outside, play wherever. So that DIY attitude,
Mm-hmm.
Play your friend's garage, right? That DIY attitude of punk. So to do it yourself. But so that DIY attitude, and that DIY attitude was about style as much as it was about the music. So do it yourself in terms of your clothing. You don't have to go to that boutique in London to buy the fancy clothes. Just go to a secondhand store and cobble together a look that looks punk good enough.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Like and you're in. And then there's a set of values, and a set of values that were oppositional, let's just say. So they're oppositional set of values. And generally those oppositional values were expressed in somewhat left-wing ways, especially in the early punk scene.
Counterculture?
Yeah, very countercultural.
Okay.
Very, very countercultural, very oppositional. I think the best way to think about it in terms of early punk is The Clash, right? It's this socialist left-wing punk band. Yeah, so you've got The Clash on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got the Sex Pistols, this nihilistic, they sort of called themselves anarchists, but certainly based on what Johnny Rotten has said over the last couple of days, definitely not anarchist. He loves his queen. He means it, man. It's hilarious. So
Queen news.
Yeah. So basically you have this almost oppositional defiant stance in punk subculture. And because of people like John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, the Sex Pistols taking that anarchist oppositional stance, there were other people who were anarchists or thought of themselves as actual anarchists or had some affinity with anarchism. Because there's this DIY start your own band thing, started their own anarchist, explicitly really anarchist punk bands that addressed political and social issues explicitly in a way where the Sex Pistols lyrics sort of danced around and used illusion and things like that, and where the Clash's socialism and frankly their musical success made them lose their punk authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
There were these underground DIY anarchist punk bands who were holding that banner of politicized punk. And that DIY ethic, that politicized ethic, allows it to become this very distinct subculture that spreads globally, because you know, if it's make a band wherever you are, doing it however you want to do it, and be oppositional. You know, be oppositional defiant. It's very easy to do.
So did fascist punks try to brand themselves as oppositional or counterculture?
That's exactly what happened.
But they're authoritarian movements, so how do you do that?
So here's how they did it. There are two things that happened. Initially, what happened was this was a positioning in the UK and Europe where fascist parties very explicitly glommed onto that oppositional stance. And that oppositional stance is what the scholar Mark Ham, who wrote one of the first books on racist skinheads, points out is a politics of what he calls the politics of fuck youism. Sorry, I probably just ruined your...
No. Okay. Not explicit rating now. You're good. We've ruined it before.
Okay. So that this politic, right, this very oppositional defiant stance of like, you know, very much like, what are you rebelling against? What have you got? Kind of stance. So there's a lot of different things you can do with what have you got. So that's one thing. The other thing is that particularly that kind of fashion-oriented punk surrounding the Sex Pistols, the Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood fashion-oriented punk, initially had swastikas as part of the punk aesthetic. And their reasoning, their theory, or the way that they sort of framed it was, you know, we live in a fascist society, so we're wearing this fascist symbol to indicate that we live in a fascist society. And also we're pissing off that entire sort of greatest, you know, we're pissing off that greatest generation of like adults who are in charge, who fought the Nazis in World War II, and when they see a swastika, they just get pissed. You know? So there's all these people wearing a swastika, not necessarily for any real ideological fascist politicized reason. But then you have an actual fascist movement in these countries and in these contexts who are like, wow, there's a bunch of teenagers wearing, and young adults wearing swastikas, running around. They're vaguely oppositional. They sort of hate everything.
Yeah.
We can steer that hate. And so that's when you start to see the neo-Nazi punk bands and racist skinhead bands. They're able to reframe that fuck youism and say, by being a fascist, you are rebelling against a kind of liberal order. Or you know, in many cases, because in European parliamentary contexts, you've got maybe a little bit further than liberal labor parties or socialist parties. And in many cases, these were the dominant political parties, at least in the very, very early days, sort of prior to that neoliberal reaction of Thatcher and Reagan. And so they're coming into it, and they've got this ready-made group of young people who are alienated from the society, what Randy Blazak identifies as a concept of strain, where there's these cultural goals that the society sets up and these structural means for achieving those goals. And when you can't achieve those goals using the means that the society sets up, or you don't share those goals, or you don't share those, all the various ways this doesn't align, you're going to seek something else. You're going to look for something else. And here's the subculture of people who were strained, who were expressing their strain through their music, through their dress, through their interactions with the world. And so the fascists have this ready-made group of angry youth who they can recruit into their movement.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
In the book, you talk about how a lot of anti-fascists become anti-fascists because they're under particular threat from fascists. And often we think of that as minority groups, people who fascists normally target, but also you talk about how some people have proximity to fascists because of their cultural affiliations. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that explains why a lot of punks became anti-fascists as well.
Exactly. And this was literally hard fought position, because one of the ironies of all of this, and I've got a chapter coming out in an edited volume that speaks to this to some extent. One of the ironies of that anarchist faction of punk. So we can kind of think about the punks splitting. You've got this far right, these far right fascist types, and you've got this explicitly anarchist, what's referred to as anarcho punk kind of punks. Okay. Those anarchist punks, particularly the main band Crass, that were the inspiration for so many of these anarcho punk bands, these anarchist punk bands, were pacifists. They were anarcho-pacifists, and they were very much wedded to a kind of principle of absolute free expression and free speech. And so they took this position that when fascists come to their shows, they should be allowed to be there so that they can, quote unquote, hear their message. And the fascists were coming to these shows mostly to like beat people up, because that's what they do. Like because it's also part of that recruitment strategy. It's that same thing, going back to that Geraldo fight. It's the same exact thing, only in the punk scene. So if you're new and you're standing in the corner and you don't have a lot of friends, or it's like you and your 3 buddies like just showed, and you're 15 years old, and you show up to this punk show and no one's talking to you, and you're already alienated in like the rest of your life, here comes this group of like tough guys who show up and they start beating people up. And then they come over to you, or they come over to you first, and they're like, hey, because they do that. That's part of the strategy, is they identify the people who are alienated among the alienated, who don't belong among the people who don't belong. And they come up and they say, hey, just standing over here, like, let's buy you a beer or whatever. Let's hang out. We're going to be your friends. Like, you don't have any other friends here. It's fine. And then they like go and beat some people up, and they're like, whoa, these guys are my friends, and they're willing to beat people up. So now I've got protection. I mean, it's very gang-like in that respect. So that's how they do it. That's how they recruit. And so these early pacifist anarchist punk bands created a kind of space where fascists could kind of show up and be a part of that. And and what happened was that because these fascists were coming to these shows, there were primarily in the UK, this is very much a UK narrative, because this was very different in continental Europe. In continental Europe, a lot more of the anti-fascism came fairly quickly. And that opposition came fairly quickly. The fascists showed up and they were like, we're ejecting you. And if we have to use violence, if we have to use force, we're going to eject you. That's just how it's going to be. But in the UK, where this anarcho-punk scene was building, there's this weird space where people could be there because they were like, we're anarchists, and if we're anarchists, we have to be open to everybody. I don't know, it's not necessarily anarchist, but that's what they believed, because there's their sort of crude understanding of anarchism. So there's a scene.
Sure.
And at the time, the primary militant opposition to fascism in the UK was around Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, which were Trotskyite affiliated. And those people would come to shows and beat people up. And so they would come to these anarcho-punk shows and they would beat up the Nazis. And these anarchist punks, who sort of were like neither, left and right are all the same, a pox upon both their houses. Crass very famously in their lyrics condemned the anti-fascists rather than condemning the fascists for violence. And said and used the kind of arguments that we hear today, that because the anti-fascists were willing to use violence against the fascists, they're basically the same thing. They're exactly the same. So this was the early kind of anarchist punk, and there's an evolution that happens where subsequent iterations, because again, anybody can start a band, anybody can be a part of this. So there are subsequent iterations of people who were a little bit they were a little bit more in the mix of things, in the street culture, in the actual subculture of this stuff, who started to take the stand that we need to be explicitly anti-fascist. We have to kick these people out. And that's ultimately what happened. So these days, you still have those kind of anarcho-pacifisty or just, anarcho, I don't know, cowardist people who just aren't willing to take a stand. But the anarchist punks these days are very explicitly anti-fascist, which is something I talk about in my book. I talk about it in this chapter that I wrote recently. So it's very much become more explicitly anti-fascist, but there are still these spaces, particularly those apolitical spaces and those right-wing spaces, where people can still kind of drift into this stuff. And it's expanded to other subcultures. So one of the things I note is that this model that they used in the anarchist punk scene, because frankly they got beat up a lot. It didn't work very well. So they started to move to other genres where maybe they wouldn't get beat up as much, but the people have a similar kind of alienation, a similar feeling of strain. So they moved to other subcultures.
Yeah, in the book you talk about nipsters. What is that term?
Yeah, that's the great thing about writing these things, is that these terms like appear and then they disappear. But this was a term that was actually developed in Germany. It's a kind of a little bit of a, I guess, sort of a portmanteau of Nazi and hipster. Mm-hmm. So they're Nazi hipsters. So they're sort of hipster fascists. And probably the example I use in my book is probably Gavin McInnes and the early Proud Boys. Yeah, the Proud Boys have morphed into something very different now. But his very early iteration of the Proud Boys was this like weird, ironic, hipster
kind of
fascist gang. Fascist gang. It was this fascist gang that had that kind of like hipster irony, that like that playing with irony of like, you know, plausible deniability. Which, you know, in my sense, a lot of hipster irony is just like trying to come up with deniability for some of the things that you do.
So like you do it as a cultural joke, appropriation. Or you say you're doing it as a joke?
You say you're doing it as a joke, but you're actually doing it because you're into it. But it's a joke, but it's not. But you know, but that was the early Proud Boys. I mean, that's how we formed it. It's like, it's a gang, but it's not really a gang, because like all of them are like in their 20s, right? Like McInnes is like, you know, he's older. He's not exactly like a young guy here. His friends are not exactly like young people. So this was a little bit of a joke. So
they're still doing the same thing.
Yeah. And so there's that. So that kind of ironic hipster thing, and we see increasingly, and this gets us to kind of where we are today. The subcultural people are still around. There's still racist skinheads kicking around. There's still like National Socialist black metal fans and bands and things like that out there. And in fact, a lot of them, in part because some of that hipster fascism involves consuming these genres of music. But now you have all kinds of subcultures. You have a whole, like, there's a subgenre of Nazi rap. There are fascist rappers. Like, if you want irony and cultural appropriation, fascist rappers, you know, and that was a thing that mainly kind of started in Europe and has wandered over into like the UK and the US context. So we have all of these kinds of subcultures, and because of the moment we're living in, where largely because of the internet, because of proliferation of social media, there's a variety of different ways that people can be subcultural. And contemporary fascism still has this very distinct subcultural edge to it that, you know, said it before, I might as well say it again, that politics of fuck youism. This sort of like, you can't tell me what to do, mom, kind of politics.
Rebellion.
Yeah, this rebellion. It's supposed to be a rebellion. It's supposed to be a rebellion against, again, that liberal order, or that neoliberal order, that order that tells you like using the right pronouns is something that you should do. You know, that being someone who respects the struggle and history of people who've been historically marginalized is something that you should do, you know, through your language, through your interactions, through maybe even acts of deference.
You talked a little bit before about how fascists are largely online and how a lot of their activity is online. Could you talk a little bit about how they've sort of inserted themselves into online subcultures and how that's kind of been part of their strategy?
Oh, yeah. And it's just an extension of that same strategy that I was describing with punk, is that you look for people who are alienated. You look for spaces where they're going to gather. And you identify those spaces. And there are clearly certain sectors of online communities. So a place like 4chan, where people would gather, where people would express frequently oppositional kinds of sentiments. And some of online culture is about, and certainly has been, even from its very early beginnings, again, going back to that kind of dirt road of bulletin board systems, the ones that weren't explicitly fascist, because there were a lot of them that weren't explicitly fascist. You'd dial into your local bulletin board and you'd interact with other, users who had modems in your local area. There was a certain amount of being offensive for the sake of being offensive, or being offensive ironically. Like, it's not, being offensive because we're just laughing at how like messed up it is. I mean, we see elements of it in pop culture. Like, the safest version of that is like half the jokes on Family Guy is saying homophobic, transphobic, racist things, and then kind of going ironic social commentary, those sort of spaces. So we have versions of that. So that's always been an element of online culture, is that kind of thing. And then you have these spaces that get created where people can do that anonymously, like on 4chan. And fascists will go there for two reasons. One, they might be really into that stuff, because they're people who also want to be in a space where they can be offensive. And two, because that's where their target demo is. That's where their target demographic is. Here's where if you're an alienated young person online, you're gravitating probably towards these spaces, or you're gravitating towards certain kinds of video games. And then you're gravitating from those to certain spaces where people talk about those certain kinds of video games. And again, it's not everybody, in the same way that not everybody who's punk was a fascist, not everybody, even at the height of the moral panic around racist skinheads in the late 80s and early 1990s in the US, most skinheads in the United States, most skinheads globally are anti-racist or non-racist, right? So in that same way that like most people who play first-person shooter and other kinds of video games are not fascists, there is a segment of that population who are vulnerable to that messaging, who are vulnerable to that feeling of, well, I feel like I'm not achieving the goals. I'm not achieving what the society has said I should achieve, particularly because I'm white, I'm male, I'm cisgender male, I'm heterosexual. I was told that there were certain things I was entitled to. I was told that there are certain things that I was entitled to because of these things. Or historically, there was this entitlement that I had to these things. And I'm not achieving those things. And that makes you vulnerable. And in come the fascists. And the fascists point to very distinct enemies and targets. They point to feminists, and they say, feminists are you think of yourself as an incel, you want to have sex, but you can't seem to make that happen. It's the feminists. They've ruined sex and sexuality, right? You wanted a certain kind of job, it's people of color. It's they're coming in through affirmative action, or they're, undocumented immigrants. They're ruining, you are, the society is being feminized, and our understandings of gender are being ruined by that combination of like feminists and trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary people, right? Like they're the reason you are feeling this way. They're an easy target, because the real reasons a person may not have access to those things are systemic. They're systems. They're, like I said, they're the way the society has been organized and is set up fundamentally. And it's a lot harder. And this has been the challenge for the left for a really long time, is to be able to point to something that is more of an abstraction, because the system is an abstraction. White supremacy is an abstraction. Capitalism is an abstraction. It's much easier to point to a certain set of bosses or policymakers and say that particular group of people are the reason things are the way they are. And if you just got rid of them and put the right people in charge, we can make this work. That's it. That's much easier than saying the entire way that this is set up is inherently exploitive. That's an abstraction.
It gives you like a concrete thing that you can point to and see, because you can't see capitalism.
Exactly. You can't see capitalism. You can't see white supremacy. You can't see patriarchy. You can't see. I mean, you can, because it does manifest. Right? It does manifest itself in these ways, in these expressions, in these hierarchies, in these ways of being and of interacting and of living in the world. But at the same time, it doesn't have that kind of physical manifestation that you can have when you personalize it.
You have to know what you're looking for to see capitalism, to see that kind of alienation.
Exactly. Whereas with fascism, it's very easy. They just personalize it. They say
marginalized group.
Exactly. It's this marginalized. It's this small, vulnerable, marginalized group of people. They're the problem.
And you can go and fight it. You can't.
Exactly.
You also can't hit capitalism. It's not a concrete thing.
Exactly. You cannot hit capitalism. You can't hit white supremacy. You can't hit structural racism. Like, it's not a thing that you can punch,
and then I was even thinking about, as you were talking about the incel, it's like they're channeling their shame of not being able to make it in the world that they're supposed to make it into all these negative things. That comes back to a very human emotion of just shame that I'm unable to do these things.
Yeah, and it comes back to entitlement, that these systems of power that we've set up have said that certain categories of people are entitled to certain things. And if you don't succeed, it's your fault.
It's your fault.
Because the way the systems we live in individualize that. They don't make it even possible frequently to recognize how whatever it is a problem of systemic kinds of dynamics. So it's your fault. More importantly, it's your fault, but what you've done so far hasn't been wrong. Like what you're doing so far hasn't been the wrong thing, because we've said that like everything you're supposed to be entitled to. So it clearly must be somebody else's fault. And so that shame of not achieving all of those things that you're supposedly entitled to gets transferred. It gets transferred into a kind of hate and a kind of anger, and anger is a secondary emotion, right? There's some other emotion driving that. So it gets transferred to that. And then here comes this social movement that has this very simple explanation, because they use this, what's called a dualism frame of good guys and bad guys. There's certain people who are, who are the forces of good. And there are certain people who are the forces of evil. So, very simple. You can point to a certain distinct set of enemies. You can point to a distinct set of heroes. That heroic narrative suddenly turns that shame around. That heroic narrative of violence, of force, of being that kind of warrior. That's why they use these warrior images all the time. It's part of that use of violence, but also that heroic warrior kind of thing. You're no longer ashamed. You're a warrior. You're, even if you're just a keyboard warrior, sending harassing DMs to whoever the newest target is, or worse yet, like on IMDb, like down rating a TV show because it's too feminist or whatever.
Oh, really?
Oh God, yeah, you can actually tell. It's pretty funny to watch. Like if you go looking at the reviews of certain things, of like certain series, it's entirely done because people are clearly mobbing up on it from somewhere and being like, this is too woke, this is too PC, this is too whatever. Because there's some little like fashy corner of the internet where they decided that was like a good, that's how they're going to be a warrior, apparently, is like downrating a series on IMDb.
That's how they get agency in their life.
Yeah, exactly. It's yeah.
Oh, the evils of capitalism gets everybody.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like you said, you can't say to them, well, here's the deal. It's capitalism. It's a system. It's the way society is set up. If we had a more, society based on equality, like it would probably resolve most of the problems you're having.
You wouldn't have to feel that shame. Yeah,
Exactly. It would resolve most of the problems you're having, and it would sort itself out.
Yeah.
Oh, Stas, this has been so interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there anything you want to say before we sign off here? Any last thoughts?
I think just in terms of final thoughts, one of the most important things is to not let the right establish what anti-fascism is. They've tried for a really long time. It's been an actual concerted effort that fascists have tried to define anti-fascism, and the right, all the way to the mainstream right of the Republican Party and Fox News, have been defining anti-fascism. And it's really important for anti-fascists to demonstrate that anti-fascism is not that monster boogeyman that it has been created to be. That's challenging in a highly decentralized movement, but it's something that people need to remember. So if you've done something as simple as listen to this podcast and get a more nuanced understanding of what anti-fascism is, bring that to your interactions with other people. Make sure that people understand that anti-fascism means opposing fascism, making sure that fascists aren't able to go from what Robert Paxton, the historian, describes as the movement stage, where they're in these small scale, street level social movements trying to take power, to the actual taking power stage, because the one thing that's going to stop them is anti-fascism.
Is raising that cost of entry to doing those actions. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And doing it in all the different ways, especially there's so many ways that you can do that are, very, very normal, everyday social movement practices. So if you feel like you want to stop fascism, there's 1,000 different ways in which you can do that. And you don't even necessarily have to team up with an Antifa group to do it.
It's for everyone. Anyone can participate.
It really is. It really is. And there are certainly a number of books and pamphlets that have expanded on that theme as well. So, go out there and search for those. Just Google everyday anti-fascism and you'll find them.
There's your cookbook, everybody. And you heard it here from a professor. Listen to this podcast as much as you can. Mm-hmm. Thanks again, Stas. This was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you. This has been great.